Kevin and I have run into each other on and off again since like 2010. So we've been running in the same circles for quite some time. But I wanted to say that, one of the challenges, at least in my world, and I know for a lot of us, one of the greatest challenges has been trying to keep our Macs up to date. And in the past, we had that nice little Jamf policy action with the, you could just either tell all the computers to update, or you could even script software update directly. But with all the different changes we've had in chip architecture, changes to the OS, the move to MDM driven update workflows, there hasn't been one right way to do it until now. We are joined today by Kevin White, the creator of S.U.P.E.R.M.A.N, and I had to write down, I have to scan my notes so I can read the software update policy enforcement with recursive messaging and notification. Now, Kevin put into the chat that there's already a new release out, but when I wrote these notes last week, it was at a 7,556 line bash script that lives at the heart of a software update workflow. So please help me welcome Kevin White. As I mentioned, you and I have been been in the same sphere. I forgot my one intro I wanted to put in there. Kevin has also literally written the book on Mac administration. How many of the different publications for Apple? There they are. I had
for the audio. I am pointing to the bookshelf behind me
with all of those nice little pretty Apple logos. Yes, well, only one level, but I mean, they don't know how wide that bookshelf is.
And some of those are translations, like into other languages.
Really?
Yeah.
What's your favorite language translation you have on there?
I think there's a Russian one back there, which is crazy.
That would be crazy.
Yeah, I don't understand.
I know you. Well, but you don't have to. I mean, yeah, I was going to say you don't have to. They're just there for the glory and the treasure. Mm-hmm. I don't think I have anything that currently has my name on it. I co-authored one of the deployment books back in the day for 10.9 or something like that, but that was about it. But for those people here who don't know you, tell us a little bit about yourself as far as how long have you been around Apple and Jamf, although I just teased some of that.
Well, I actually, I've been around Apple and Jamf my entire professional career. I actually at one point worked at Apple, then left Apple to go out on my own. I have actually technically been on my own since I left Apple, but I am primarily a Jamf integrator partner, and that's where I make my money now that I definitely don't write books anymore. And that's basically what I do is I do consulting primarily for Jamf. I have a couple customers here and there, but most of my work is directly for Jamf as a partner service provider.
You were one of the first waves of Jamf partners, weren't you?
Yeah, I had to look at my emails because that question, the poll earlier, I was like, when was my first email? 2008 I was one of the first partner providers because at the time I was an Apple Services partner provider, whatever we were called back then. And Jamf was wanting to obviously grow their organization, and as a services, us having contracts, people like us is a good way to do that without actually having to hire people, right?
Right.
And also it gives us, the freedom to work sort of our own schedule and not have to go to meetings. It's a big deal. Not being told by your boss what you need to do next. It's good stuff.
I'll have to pick your brain later and find out when exactly you worked at Apple. I'm now starting to wonder if maybe we overlapped, although I know we wouldn't have been in the same building.
It was before the books, so it was like 2006, 7, 8.
Oh, okay.
I was just there for short. I was only there for like 2 years.
But same for me. I think it was more like 18 months. I was on the build engineering team from 10.0 to 10.2. I got brought in because they were, with the move to OS 10, they needed people with the Unix experience. So that was the beginning of. It was funny that until recently I was telling people, I'm pretty much cross-platform, and then I realized 23 years of being Mac only, I got to quit saying that. I think at this point it's time to admit it. So with S.U.P.E.R.M.A.N, I mean, I was lucky to come and see your presentation at JNUC, and that was actually my first introduction to S.U.P.E.R.M.A.N. But I was taking a look at the GitHub repo and going back through some of the commits and seeing the progress on this. But they say necessity is the mother of invention. So to create a several thousand line shell script, what was that pain point, that final point where you couldn't take it any longer and decided to start scripting something like this?
Sure. Well, just to start off, as the creator of it, you can just call it Super. Just
Yeah.
straight up, like that's the command, that's the name of it. That name actually is an acronym because the original customer, who I was as a professional services vendor, I was helping with the customer, and this customer wanted me to help them solve that problem for their organization. And this is an organization that loves big projects that have acronyms. So it was just, basically a process of elimination to come up with a good acronym. And that one just sort of, came out as like, oh, that's the winner. Obviously, we can call it Superman or Super or whatever. And so that's the genesis of the name. But totally call it Super. It's way less, syllables. And I guess the thing is, for years I was burdened with a project where I was fixing Apple's lack of doing something right, and that's why I wrote books. Right. And so I felt like, you know what, I don't have a burden fixing Apple's problems right now. So maybe I should create this project for myself to try to
Find
fix
a
stuff that
problem to
Apple
fix
won't
it.
get
Yeah.
right and give myself headaches about it. And it's like your home, you always have homework, like it's never
Yeah.
right because somebody's going to find a bug, or Apple will introduce a bug, or Jamf will introduce a bug, and you're like, oh, well, now I've got to add another 1,000 lines of code to work around that. And yeah, everybody here gets it. The Apple software update process is a mess. It's not, even when it's working, is a bad user experience. It's that simple. Even when it works, even if it wasn't unreliable, the mechanisms that Apple gives us to enforce these updates on Apple Silicon is a bad workflow. It's just, it's like, it doesn't work for anyone. The administrators don't like it. The users don't like it. I don't understand how Apple thinks it's a good user experience. It's literally a terrible user experience. Either the user ignores the notifications because Apple does such a good job of making new ways to ignore them.
Yeah.
Through either bad UI,
Focus
on
modes
macOS, the UI is terrible.
Mm-hmm.
Or I mean, like literally, they went from Do Not Disturb to this whole focus engine. Now it's like, oh, here's a half dozen customizable ways for you to ignore the alerts to update your Mac. So even by design, that's bad. And then on top of that, when you do the MDM push, if you're trying to enforce it, the computer just freaking restarts. It's like a message restart. And like, that's a terrible user experience too. So, I mean, the real problem is that just, we don't have a good workflow. Nobody likes it. I don't know who likes it. Maybe somebody Apple likes it. I don't think anybody likes it. And so
and Apple has always said that they're all about the end user. And so if for a person, like if this is just your personal computer, it's not, I don't know. This is the one place when it comes to like running an app, fine. But when it comes to managing a system, no, absolutely not.
Well, I mean, there is that, I think, obviously I used to work at Apple. If you ever worked at Apple, you know that like internally there's really no IT infrastructure on your device. So it's like, how do you update? You freaking run software update, right? Like, I would imagine the vast majority of people are like just running software update, and internally to Apple, that's like, how do you update an enterprise? Well, you use software update. I mean, we're an enterprise. We're the most richest company in the world. Yet somehow we just use software update. Well, that's because Apple can fire bad employees.
Yeah.
Right? Like if you're a bad employee, Apple just gets rid of you. Other organizations don't have that, or other organizations are literally government-run agencies that have mandates where you don't have a choice about the update schedule. And also, I have had some customers who have been told by their insurance carriers that they will not be underwritten unless they can get everybody updated within 3 days. 3 days.
Wow.
And they won't even be covered by their insurance company anymore. So, I mean, these are real problems to solve. And Apple's consumer-focused sort of methodologies just don't cut it for an organization that requires updates in a timely manner. And of course, we don't want to bother the users. Or if we do bother them, we want to give them opportunities to defer it till later. And then once you start going down that road, then you want to do things like, hey, I'm in the middle of a Zoom right now. It would really suck if a notification appeared. Right? So we obviously want to work around that. And then, we need to have deadlines. And so initially it just came as, hey, we need to actually have deadlines here. And we don't want to just, cut the user off. We want to actually give them actionable dialog boxes that we can customize. And I want, different deferment options and different deadline options. So that was the initial sort of idea and the genesis of Super. And then what's happened, of course, is that as I got deeper into this, I realized sort of how unreliable the update mechanism is. When you do tell it to go, sometimes you tell it to go and it's just like meh, or it goes and then it crashes, or there's basically the software update process is incredibly complex. There's a lot of things not only going on locally on the computer, it's making connections back to Apple to validate things. It is, there's a lot of steps that have to go on. And then on top of that, the MDM workflow adds a whole nother layer of complexity before the system even starts to update. And so and it's also a black box. You know, like you send an MDM push and you kind of don't know when it's going to arrive.
Right.
And so you start having to have code to watch that process and watch these processes. In fact, the biggest difference from Super 2, which I introduced last year, and Super 3 is Super 3 assumes everything's going to break. And it has to watch it all and do something about it when it breaks. So, you know, you talked about the length of the script. 3/4 of it's just waiting for shit to break. That's really what it is. And like, what do you do? Okay, this didn't happen. Now what do I do? This didn't happen. Now what I do? You know.
Yeah, I know you're working with. I know you're working with Hugo to help us with implementing it with one, and I know that there was some long discussions about the amount of timeout to put in there, because it's just like, you know, wait a little bit longer, see if it's going to break yet.
Yeah, and that's one of the hard things for me to gauge too, because I only have so many different test systems to work with, and I can make timings that I think are reasonable. And then it's like, okay, it took my computer 5 minutes. I'm going to double it, make it 10, because I have a MacBook Pro MX. I have my own gigabit connection. Like, you know, I'm assuming a best case scenario, so let's double that timing. But then, you know, people's computers still do different things, and I can't test for every single combination of every computer on Earth, and certainly not whatever your network's going to do. And so, yeah, that becomes complex, right? As you add more features and you add more robustness to the process, your script gets longer and longer. I mean, even if you just start scripting, you know, you want to do one line, right? I want to do one thing. It's just a one-line script. But then you start actually adding all the robustness that you need into that one line, and you end up with, I just want to run, you know, it's 1% do something, 99% make sure that when you do the thing, it's going to do the right thing.
Right. Right.
And so that's
error
why
checking and validation. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's why the script ends up just ballooning out of. It's not just features I want to add. It's ballooning out of control, so that because this process is so complicated and people have so many different workflows that they want to have. In fact, something that was a really big deal to add, but it became necessary, is the MDM mechanism was just breaking. I would send the command and the Mac would just go whatever. And so one of my customers, who was actually, it was good that I had this because it was a Jamf customer and we were using my time to develop this, is a failover mechanism for when MDM fails, we're just going to prompt the user for their password. Because if MDM isn't going to work, it's going to continue not to work. If it fails once, it's, you know, you can't just keep yelling at a computer over MDM, do it again, do it again, do it again. It's just probably not going to go. And so there's so one of the things I implemented earlier this year was a failover mechanism, or an option to say, hey, if MDM fails, just prompt the user for their password, because at this point we got to get this computer updated, and we might as well ask them for their password to try to get it done, right?
I saw at your JNUC session. I don't want to taint the answer to this question because I suspect I know it, but I wanted to ask, what feature or aspect of this script has been your biggest challenge? What you talked about how things balloon, but what was the biggest little either scope creep or trick that came into this where you're like, oh, this should be pretty easy, and then it turned out to be a nightmare?
I'd never assume anything's going to be easy. But the biggest change from 2 to 3, aside from the assumption that everything's going to break, is to support upgrades also, right? Updates and upgrades. And I wanted to make that as sort of built in as possible to where the administrator using it doesn't have to think about where it's, because here's the thing about macOS, it's complicated. The version of the OS you're starting with, the authentication mechanism that you're going to use, obviously Intel versus Apple Silicon, like there are like 8 different ways you might end up updating a system. Upgrading a system, but depending on the workflows. And so finding all of those things and knowing which path to take is a bunch of logic. Here's a quick example. If you're running 12.3 or later, Apple has this new, they call it like the Delta upgrade, where it actually leverages software updates updater to upgrade you without the installer. And that's pretty sweet because it's really it is really fast. Like when it works, it's like you can start the process, download, prepare, and restart. And on like an Apple Silicon Mac, it literally takes 10 minutes to go from 12.3 to 13, whatever. That's awesome. But that only works if you're using local authentication. If you're using an MDM push, you can't do that. You have to go download the whole installer because the MDM push in macOS 12 doesn't know how to do those Delta updates yet, or upgrades yet. And so that's just the kind of stuff you have to discover and experiment with and figure out the hard way so that when somebody's using S.U.P.E.R., doesn't have to think about that. An admin using S.U.P.E.R. just has to say, S.U.P.E.R. go upgrade my fleet, and then S.U.P.E.R. knows the right thing to do based on the version of macOS that you're currently running.
Yeah,
so that's
and
architecture. There's a ton of logic in that.
Yeah. I mean, that was one of my bigger takeaways from that was just seeing at that presentation was seeing how much, depending on architecture and version, what had to go. One of the notes, this was one of my favorite quotes, and I had to write this down. One of my favorite quotes from that presentation you wrote, "I'll probably just grab erase install and shove it amoeba style into S.U.P.E.R." Is that what ended up happening?
For the download of a full installer, if S.U.P.E.R.'s detection is I have to download the installer, I do leverage erase install for that because Graham's script is great. It has a lot of built-in stuff to validate the installers the right well, first of all, it helps me figure out which one to download, right? Because it goes and scrapes it all and lets us know, hey, this version's valid for this logic board, right? Because even that alone is a really hard problem. It's like, I'm on a what kind of Mac now, and I have to know which one to download because software update doesn't expose that complexity. When you ask software update for a list, it gives you the list for just that computer. But when you're trying to figure out which installer to download, like that's complex logic. And so that's something erase install does for me that I don't have to think about. I just ask it, give me the latest that's compatible, and let's go.
I'm stealing a question from the chat so I can get to that in a little bit. I want to make sure to get to that one.
And also full disclosure about why I'm not using something more contemporary like Mist. It's because Mist only supports macOS 11 or later. And if we're going to be updating macOS 10 computers, we have to use something that goes back further.
Yeah, and that's also the other joy is anything, the entire post OS 10 world has created, every single version has created its own new challenges.
Yeah, that's also why the dialog boxes created by S.U.P.E.R. are based on IBM Notifier.
Yep.
It's because IBM Notifier supports back to 10.15, whereas Swift Dialog does not. Swift Dialog
I think that only goes to 11 something. Yeah, right? Yeah. In fact, we've been looking to move because Dep Notify hasn't been updated in forever, looking to, even though Swift Dialog doesn't have every feature I want yet, and I've got a couple of feature requests in there, the fact that it's being actively maintained and is great, but the fact that it doesn't go all the way back to some of our clients' OSs makes that a bit of a challenge. I wanted to ask, and we've alluded to this, but I wanted to see if you had any particular hard numbers. Yeah, thank you, Todd, Coco Dialog. In a typical environment of several thousand computers, so think about some of your bigger clients, mix of architecture, but dialing in within the last couple of OSs. So let's say post OS 10, what would you expect to see in terms of success rate? Because we've been having very mixed results, and I don't want to big honking text, Bruce, you're funny. But I wanted to, what kind of things have you been seeing when you deploy? I mean, it's your tool, so if anybody's going to have the best success rate for it, it's going to be you. What kind of success rate have you been saying of, all right, we're going to send this out and get everybody up to date?
So that's a great question because it's actually the customer who is the original customer who inspired /paid Jamf to pay me to help them create this. So first of all, if you have a large Jamf fleet, what percentage of your Jamf devices are even checking in, right?
Yeah, so that's always a fun part.
What's your 100%? You have to first start with, well, what's 100% mean? Are we talking about 100% of active Macs or 100% of
Yeah.
just Macs in general?
I was assuming computers that are actually hitting those recurring check-ins.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying. Well, I can only give you the number that they have given me for their entire fleet. So I don't know what percentage of this is computers that are like idle, you know. And this is a customer with thousands of Macs, to be clear. They are just under 80%, like 13.31.
Okay. That's still better numbers than we've been having what we seem to be hitting is this is going to taint one of my upcoming questions, but I don't care. It seems to be a lot of the MDM. It's like you send out the command, nothing happens, and then you go and you take a look, and is the computer even receiving MDM? Does it have dozens of MDM commands? But yeah, it's the number I was given for the last push was some of our last push to get a client up to date was less than 50%. Everything else is still sitting back. Have you heard numbers like that? Or is that an indicator that we need to be doing something differently?
Oh yeah. I mean, definitely numbers that can be low for sure. And the problem is, and this is something I know because it's a function of Super, is to watch the MDM commands when it's expecting for the update or upgrade to happen. And then to react when those commands literally don't show up in a timely fashion. Because if we're using Jamf, the workflow is you say push an update, and this all assumes the computer's paying attention, and I'm awake and good. Jamf sends out a command that says, go check for updates, computer. And then Jamf gives the computer 5 minutes. And then 5 minutes later, Jamf sends a command saying, what updates do you have? If that gets returned back to Jamf, Jamf evaluates that, and then sends down the command to actually try to do it. Sends down the command to go update. Super watches that to make sure that it happens. And I don't remember what the timeout is, but I have a timeout in there that basically says, hey, if you haven't gotten this command in like 10 minutes, just go ahead and assume it's failed, and then we'll try later, or depending on your options, ask the user for authentication. But I will tell you that I've recently found out, like literally this week, as I was testing the mechanism to update rapid security responses, a little birdie at Jamf told me about something that I did not know could happen. And that something is an invalid bootstrap token. The mechanisms that we have used to see if the computer has a bootstrap token, and I should clarify, you need a bootstrap token to push the MDM command to update the computer.
Right.
On Apple Silicon. It's a requirement. That's how it does it without the password. Literally, Apple Silicon has a rule. You have to authenticate updates. Okay, there's two ways to do this. A password of a volume owner, so like the local user, or the bootstrap token. So obviously your MDM uses this bootstrap token, because it doesn't know the user's passwords, to send that command and validate and make the computer restart. So Jamf has always historically, done its job and escrowed that bootstrap token. It saves it in the database. And you can look in your Jamf inventory, is the bootstrap token escrowed? You can run a command on your Mac, the profiles command. You can say, is my bootstrap token escrowed? Super already did this. But then a little birdie said, just because the bootstrap token is escrowed doesn't mean it's valid. That just means at some point in the past, one was stored there. He said, run this command locally on the computer, and it will tell you if your bootstrap token is valid or not. And that was a revelation to me, because one of the ways that the MDM profile can fail is that it gets pushed, but there's the bootstrap token that Jamf pushes isn't the right bootstrap token.
Jacob
so
asked
it just
the
doesn't
question.
go. And
Jacob in the chat asked the question I want to know. Do you know off the top of your head what that command is to query that?
Okay, well, here's the real part that's it's 13.3 or later only. So you literally, the command, now I'm sure that there is a server-side solution to this, where you could probably send out an MDM push to ask if it's valid and try to do a new one. But the command, and by the way, so if you want to know the command, it's an MDM client. It's when you run the MDM client command locally to find the device information. It can tell you, what it actually tells you is you can actually send the erase all contents push. That's literally what the test is. It says, it basically does a bunch of checking to see if the MDM can send the erase all content push. So it actually has nothing to do with software update. But it does validate, and by the way, again, 13.3 or later only. I don't know the line off the top of my head. If you go look at the latest builds of Super, it's in there in the check bootstrap token function. So it's buried in there. But it only works on 13.3 or later. So prior to 13.3, I have no idea how to see if your Bootstrap token's valid.
Joy.
But obviously the newest versions of Super do this if you're on 13.3 or later. Like you want to know where a couple of those 100 lines of code just added was? 13.3 or later, go do this check now because I know you can. And so, but another cool thing though that Super does, even on older OSs, is if the MDM failover happens and we ask for the user's password, guess what I can use that password for in addition to running the update?
What's that?
Fix your Bootstrap
Fix
token.
the Bootstrap token. Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
So basically,
yeah, because I know
yeah.
you had said during the at the meetup, I don't remember what the context was, but it caused my ears to perk up because I'd never thought of it. That in the situation where MDM wasn't working, I think it was where you would query the user for something. I don't remember how it came up, but you were using the keychain to store a local an admin account.
That is the option if you don't want to use MDM. So that
right.
Super also has a workflow that's MDM less. And that workflow, well, there's a couple things it can do. If you don't have an MDM, so even if you're not using Jamf, the default Super behavior, if you don't have an MDM, is just prompt the user for their password. Actually, it does some checks first to see if you have because here's the thing about Apple Silicon, you have to be a volume owner. You don't have to be an admin, but you do have to be a volume owner. So it does that check first to make sure that you can authenticate as a volume owner. And then it asks you for your password, and it uses its own dialogue. So this is not a dialogue that's a system dialogue. This is a Super dialogue, so you can customize it or whatever. And actually, you could just use Super that way. If you wanted to use Super without an MDM, it totally works. In fact, my idea there was, I want to do what Nudge does, only without Apple's interfaces, because Apple's interfaces are inconsistent.
Yes.
What version of Mac do you have? Which button do you push? Is it already downloaded or not? Do you have the update now or upgrade now button or the later link at the bottom? Like, it's just, even that interface is not good. And between different versions, you never know what to tell your end users. Which button do you press? Like, that's the simple question. Apple, what button do I tell my 1,000 fleet of Mac users to press across different versions of OS to actually do the update? And you have to build an if-then tree just to answer that question.
Right. Yeah.
So I said, you know what? Screw that. I'm going to make one dialog box that's going to authenticate everything.
Well, okay. On that line, because one of the questions I received in advance was wondering if, do you intend to add customization to the text fields for the pop-up notifications the end users interact with?
Let me answer that question in a second. I'm looking at the chat and somebody's saying the Bootstrap token in the chat. No, that profiles command Bootstrap token is the current method to tell you if at some point in history it was escrowed. Being escrowed is not being valid. Thank you, Jason. Jason put the right one in.
Oh, okay.
So Jason,
and that's nice and easy to remember. Yeah.
That also has a bunch of grepping and setting in it to actually just return the value instead of the whole thing, because Apple does everything now with what is it called, JSON. And so that you get a JSON return, and the rest of that line sorts it out to not JSON.
Yeah, I love the fact that we've got one of the few Unixes that doesn't have a built-in JSON tool, and yet now all of a sudden we're going to JSON. I mean, don't get me wrong. Yeah. I love the format, and I'm glad we're doing it. I just wish we had like JQ or something built in.
Yeah. In fact, I'm thinking for the next version of Super, I'm going to download JQ.
There you go.
So I don't have to do so much setting bash and all. Anyhow, I'm sorry. Back to your actual question. Can you customize the Jamf? I'm sorry.
No, the question was whether or not. The question was whether you were thinking about whether or not you were planning on adding customization to it.
Well, it's actually already customizable.
Okay.
There's a couple things that are built in via options. The simple one is just change the icon, so you can brand it for you. That's already a flag and options. Because it's built on IBM Notifier, there's also a display accessory function that can draw a window with your arbitrary contents of choice there. So that's already options built into Super. However, the main text of Super, the what version am I doing, and then what's the deferral time, that's all based on calculations of like what kind of deferrals and deadlines you gave Super. So that part is sort of hard-coded into the script, except there is a function inside of Super called set display language that has variables just right there in a huge list of every single thing Super could generate. And so, although it is hard-coded built into the script right now, if you wanted to localize it, you just look in that function and go down the list and just change all the words to whatever you want them to say. And that's why, if you go look at that function right now, you'll notice that function alone is like 150 lines long of different things it could do. That's how many different variations are there. That's the problem. It's like, what if you have deadlines? What if you don't have deadlines? What if they're expired? What if you're doing an upgrade? It's like, that's, again, 8,000 lines of code. This is what it comes to when you want a feature like this. So going forward, though, so in other words, right now, you have to mess around with the script, but there is features there for you. Looking forward, I am actually going to replace IBM Notifier with probably with Swift dialog. And then when I do that, I will come up with some other method a la Nudge, probably taking inspiration from them, where they have sort of like a defined file that that you can set them for different languages and whatnot. So it is customizable right now, and it could be better, and I'm aware of that.
Okay. Yeah, I know that you're pulling information in from local plists, from managed plists, as well as from the Jamf policy command lines. So, you're pulling information from a lot of places, so I didn't know where to go with that. I have one last question.
Just to clarify, go ahead. If you want to change any of the strings that Super creates for itself, you have to modify the script. But the icon and the arbitrary window that it can draw of just whatever you want to in there, you don't even have to get to the script for that. That's all just options in the command line of the plist.
Okay, cool. Then I probably just looked right past it. I get dense at times with that.
Well, I did also just one more thing about that.
Yeah,
the documentation is way out of date. The wiki is out of date. It doesn't have any of this stuff. So I'm basically giving you a pass, Chad, for not knowing that it can do all this. Because right now, the only documentation that is relevant is the changelog. Because I've just been putting out so many builds with so many... It's like the changelog has everything in it. And also, just for the audience, like, don't look at the wiki right now. I mean, you can. Some of the commands are still there. But the changelog is where all these newer features are in Super 3.0. Because the wiki is basically versioned at 2.0 right now.
Yeah, that was kind of my gist as well. In fact, one of the questions I was going to ask in here was, for a Jamf admin who was just picking up for the first time, what would you consider to be best practice for implementing? Because looking at the document, I know that like in the wiki, when you talk about it, it's like getting started, it's like just running it from the command line, putting it into test mode, and would you consider for the sometime in all of your surplus time putting together like here's the most straightforward basic implementation to hopefully get you past that 50% closer to 80% number, and then let the rest of the tweaks go?
It's about time, right? Like I can either add new features to Super and implement bug fixes, or I can make documentation, and that's why the wiki's out of date.
Yeah. And maybe that's a place for video, right? Just ramble to a camera.
No, I want to document. My timeline is as such. I've been waiting for rapid security responses because that's kind of what I was like. Version 3 is done when rapid security responses are out. And so this week that happened. And so at this point, I'm kind of considering version 3 as feature complete. Fixing bugs is one thing, but adding more features, I'm done for now for 3. Now I can transition to wrapping up, polishing up version 3, writing the wiki so that there is documentation that is good. And then my goal is basically, it's that page, if you're a Jamf administrator, like what to do in Jamf, is going to be very clear, like if you want to do this via Jamf, XYZ.
Okay, perfect.
Because most of the wiki is describing all the features, and I'm very well aware of this, because a lot of Jamf's documentation is, here's what every feature does. But they don't tell you, like, here's the recipe. And I'm aware of that. The reality is, it's much easier to create if your goal is to be thorough, you have to document every feature. And that's kind of step one, like the baseline. I have to document what everything does so that it's clear what the feature does. And there's a bunch of features in Super. And then step 2 is, okay, make like your recipe for what is kind of the best case or best use of Super in a Jamf environment. And it's pretty simple. If you have basic needs, you just make a policy with the superscript and a couple options in the parameters, and you can be done. It's everybody sees all these features and they get excited and they're like, I got to throw everything in. And then, and it's kind of like when you're making a meal, like just because you threw everything in the pot doesn't mean it's going to taste good. Like,
yeah,
start with base. And so my basic general advice about Super is the getting started intentionally doesn't turn on any features. Like start there with test mode, see how it works, add things as you need them. Don't throw everything in. I see too many people that are literally like, they take the XML that's like all the
hard
features
count
and they just
and all the,
put it in Jamf and go, well, that must be the right way to do it. No, that's like every feature ever. That's like turning on every switch in Word. You don't do that. Like, so start with as few features as possible, adding only the ones necessary.
My last and very brief answer, because I saw Chris come back on camera, so I know he wants to do the final announcement. But I did want to ask the last question I put in here. What, if anything, can this group do to help? I know you've got a lot of people who are, I mean, this is a great, big, large group of people that came together because they love, because like you said, Apple and made this a nightmare and you've made it less nightmarish. Is there anything we can do to help you?
Well, obviously testing and providing feedback on the Slack channel, and even obviously just being involved in the Slack, MacAdmin Slack channel is a huge help. But if you are going to test and you don't know why it's working, can you please RTFL? Read the freaking log, people. I cannot tell you how many answers I'm like, did you read the log? And I pride myself on my log creation because I spent, again, where all those thousands of lines? Freaking logs, people. I make it so you can read them in English. Sorry if you don't speak English. But I can't tell you how many of the stuff ends up in the channel. I'm like, well, in the log, it says this. So there you go. So just please take a couple minutes to read through the log. It is not like other people who don't know how to make logs for humans. They basically make the log.
I don't know who you're talking about. Yeah.
I mean, a good example is the Jamf log is a great local log on the computer because at least it tells you what it's doing in pretty good English. So I kind of modeled it after that. I'm like, what the hell is it doing right now? Oh, here's in pretty clear English what it's doing right now. And obviously it's not perfect, but just please, in fact, one of the problems I have with Super now is the logs are getting too big. That's a thing I got to fix in the next version is to cycle through those things.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
All right. Well, I will thank you very much for coming in. This has helped me out a lot, but this is like a more, I know you were doing more, JNUC kind of forced us to be in more presentation mode, give information. So I love the fact that we were able to do a lot more questions and learn more about it. Thank you for coming.